All right. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us for today's seminar hosted jointly by the Intelligence Project and the Homeland Security Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. We are thrilled to host today's panel with Representative Abigail Spanberger, Professor Juliette Kayyem, and Intelligence Project Director Paul Colby to discuss the events of January 6th, the security and intelligence failures that led to these events, and what it all means for the future. A few logistics and ground rules. Today's session will be in webinar format, so audience members won't have their audio or video on. We'll be ending at 2:15 rather than 2:30, and we'll leave the final 20 minutes for audience Q&A. Once it's time for Q&A, I ask you to please direct your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paul Colby.
Thank you, Caitlin. Welcome, Representative Spanberger and Juliette Kayyem. Great to have you with us today and great to have an audience with us today. I think it's an important conversation on an important day. I think back on the events of January 6th, 21, and I can't help but compare them with the events of September 11th, 2001. I think each are seminal days in American history, will go down in the iconography of American history as dark days. I think that there's some comparisons to be made and some clear contrasts. Obvious contrast being that the attack on 9/11 was an external attack by foreign enemies. The events of 6 January 21 were a domestic attack by domestic enemies. I think that the most recent attack is a more existential threat to American democracy and American society. And obviously, in terms of response, 9/11 united us as a nation in response and generated an overwhelming response to counter that threat, to understand it, and to defeat it. For me, so far, the response to the events of 6 January have been underwhelming. It's an attack that has divided us as a nation, not united us. And I'm worried that we face an extended fight against the types of extremism, the types of political violence, the types of rhetoric which fosters that, which poses a real threat to our democracy and to our society. I'd like to welcome Representative Spanberger and Ms. Kayyem to talk about three things. One, to provide sort of a recollection of the day. Where were you? What did you see? How did you feel? What happened on that day? And then to break it down into two kind of wider questions of what went wrong. Did we have an intelligence failure on the day? Did we not know this was coming? Could we not predict it? Do we have a law enforcement crisis planning, crisis management failure? Do we just simply have the intelligence but didn't prepare for it, didn't take it seriously? How can we prevent this from happening again? And what are the factors that went behind that? But I also like to look going forward, in particular about what is the role of law enforcement in intelligence in countering a very different threat, not countering Islamic extremists based in the Fatah or based in North Africa or in other hostile, denied, ungoverned areas, but rather a threat that that evolves and exists, within our own borders in our own country. What is the role of intelligence community, if any? Where's DHS, CIA, NSA? Do we have to rethink authorities and missions on this? And what are the best ways to think about countering this? And indeed, do we? Or is this simply a one-off event that we will represent a peak anger moment, which will then fade? So with that, let me introduce Representative Spanberger, second-term Congresswoman from the 7th District of Virginia, a former CIA case officer with years of service, domestic and foreign service, representing our country. Previously a federal agent with the Postal Inspection Service, and in the private sector after leaving the CIA, worked, and I think this is something we'd like to talk about later as well, is work to help academic institutions diversify their student bodies. So obviously something that we've been focused on here, both at the Intelligence Project, but also at the Belfer Center. Juliette Kayyem, well known to almost everyone who's viewing this, a Belfer lecturer in international security at the Harvard Kennedy School, faculty director of the Homeland Security Projects and Global Health and Security Projects, CNN national security analyst, previously an assistant secretary for intergovernmental affairs with Department of Homeland Security, and a renowned expert in emergency preparedness, crisis response, and radicalization. And some of her writings before and after these events were really prescient. And she spoke in one article of leadership and president who's provoking acts of random but predictable violence. And I think that sort of really nailed what we saw. So with that, let me turn over to Representative Spanberger for her recollections of the day and thoughts on what happened. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me join you. And to everyone who's watching, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit more, and I think it's particularly timely as the impeachment trial is moving forward. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what happened on January 6th. So I was in the Capitol on January 6th. I was in the House chamber on January 6th. And to break down what happened is things escalated quickly. We had known that that day was going to present a challenge. We had known that there would be protesters in town. I had advised my team, nobody should come to the office if you don't need to. If you're going to be there, please dress down. Ensure that people on the streets, outside the Capitol, have no way of knowing that you're a Capitol Hill staffer. Just kind of focus, get to the Capitol, and then we'll go from there. And so at around 1 o'clock, we gathered in the House chamber to begin what is our constitutional duty of recognizing electoral college votes. And so it's a joint session of Congress. The Senate is there, the Vice President is there presiding, and we go through the process. And as we're there in the House chamber, and I was seated up in the gallery because of COVID, we tried to limit the number of the space that we were taking up. So we had some members of Congress who were down on the floor, which is where we typically sit, and then some of us up in the gallery. Ultimately, we started getting very quick, kind of frenzied updates. There were text alerts that went out that there was a bomb threat in one of the office buildings in the complex. So folks who are in that office building evacuated to another office building. And those of us in the Capitol, it seemed as though things were still okay. And then things turned very, very quickly. It turned very quickly right after there was the challenge to the Arizona election results. And so at that point, because there was a challenge, there was a House member and a Senate member participating in that challenge, our joint session of Congress ended. The senators went back to their side of the Capitol, and we continued process in ours. And at that time, the Speaker of the House was seated in the Speaker's chair. In a couple minutes into the proceedings, she was whisked away. And at that moment, everything changed. So she was whisked away. We continued with debate, but we're getting updates and alerts that things were not right, that the protests were coming to the Capitol, that we expected disruptions. And all of a sudden, it was, there are people in the building. And the level of kind of confusion and frenzy about how to react to that was just pushed kind of across the board. And so the folks who were down on the floor were, do we continue? Do we not continue? At that point, leadership on the House and on the Democratic and the Republican side, they were taken away, which is kind of a comical moment when other people are evacuated. You really stop and think like, maybe I shouldn't be here anymore. But at that point, we were notified that there was a chemical spray. Later we learned that Capitol police officers had utilized tear gas, and that there were protesters utilizing a version of tear gas trying to overtake each other. So, we've deployed out our gas masks that, are under the chairs. And so there's this humming noise because they are the types of gas masks that start once you sort of pull them apart. So there's this loud humming noise as we're there. And then we lock all the doors. And that's when the banging started. That's when literally insurrectionists were trying to bang down the doors to get into the House chamber. And there's still members of Congress, our teams, the parliamentarian, the clerks on the floor and in the gallery, and members of the press were with us as well in the gallery. So once they were able to create an evacuation pathway for members who were on the floor, they were able to evacuate out from one corner of the building. Unfortunately, those of us who were up in the gallery were actually on the opposite side of the building. So we were on the side of the building at that time where ultimately there was an insurrectionist who was shot. There was no way for us to get out on that side of the building. So they evacuated out the first group. And from there, the level of just chaos really increased. And so we went from the side up in the gallery, that's typically where the press would sit, where visitors and the public would sit. And so there's gallery sections and they're separated by railings. And we had to get from one side to the other side. And so we're climbing over and under these railings, when we thought we were going to be certifying election results. And we ultimately made our way over to the other side. But at that point, the engagement between Capitol police officers and the insurrectionists on the other side of the door, at least at the main entrance to the House chamber, was aggressive. They had Capitol Police had barricaded up the door with benches and with tables. And there's many pictures, I'm sure many of you have seen them, where you've got all the Capitol Police officers with their firearms trained on the holes in the glass that these insurrectionists had banged through. There's screaming, there's yelling. It's put your gas mask on, take your gas mask off, get down on the ground. There was a significant concern that if someone was, fired a shot on either side of that door, that some of us might be downrange. So, we're taking cover in between chairs, or the seating rows up in the gallery. There are people crying, there are people praying. And it was chaos. And then sometime later, we heard the gunshot. We were in the gallery when the gunshot stopped the insurrectionists from being able to make their way into the House chamber. From there, sometime later, we were actually able to evacuate out that side. And when we came out, there were insurrectionists who were all prone out on the ground with police officers, with control at that point of the circumstance and the situation. And we evacuated out down multiple flights of steps and to another building, to a secure location. But what was really notable for me, as Paul mentioned, as I'm sure Paul's experience, as a CIA officer, we had trained for a whole variety of different events. There's different training courses that you go through, including with sort of simulated attacks on locations where you may be. And so I had in the back of my mind the entire time this almost like confusing sense of like, I have trained for this, but it was supposed to be at some embassy overseas, or it was supposed to be at some event in another foreign country where you knew what the risks were, but it is happening here. And so it was actually really that part of the perspective. I kept having these moments of thinking, I actually can't believe this, because it isn't that this sort of attack happens that I find extraordinary and unbelievable. It's that it happens in our country that I'm actually unable to sort of mentally process in this moment. And I, in the time since, have heard from a particular friend who was posted overseas at the time when the parliament in that country was overrun. There was a corrupt authoritarian in leadership. The parliament was overrun. She was serving there with her family, including children. And she said she watched it all unfold on television and thought, oh my God, I've got to get my family out of this country. I'll continue to do my job, but I got to get my family out of this country. And she said that watching on television, essentially the same thing happened at the United States Capitol. As someone who has served this country, it was heartbreaking to think how many foreign diplomats, how many foreign journalists, how many folks are at their houses thinking, oh my God, I have to get my family out of this country. And this country is the United States of America. It's shocking and it's jarring. And it's as we learn more and more about that day, the level of organization, some of the efforts and intentions, it becomes even more shocking. And I think some of the initial media reports that displayed some of the most outrageous of the insurrectionists, of the white nationalists, the domestic violent extremists who broke through the door, almost lightened what ultimately we knew was the reality of the circumstance. Later learning and watching the video of them beating police officers with flagpoles with the flag still attached, those images are shocking. And so I look forward to today's conversation, a little bit more about what happened, what was happening or not happening in the days leading up, and then where we go from here. But again, thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation, and I'm grateful to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Abigail. And I'm just struck as you spoke about, you really conveyed the sense of chaos, the tenuousness of the situation, how volatile it was, how dangerous it was. And I just find myself reflecting, so easily could have been an extended hostage crisis, could have been a mass shooting. I had visions of the Russian parliament with it being occupied and, tanks firing on the Capitol. Those were the images in my head at the time, and I'm concerned at the minimization of that this is, the history gets retold on that. So it's so important that you describe that.
And for those of us who are on the inside, so we've got our member pins. As when there's so many House members, we wear these to identify ourselves. One might think a badge would be useful, but we use jewelry. And so, at one point I was telling colleagues, like, take your pins off. At the very least, if this is going to become a hostage scenario, make it harder for them to know who should be the higher value targets. And, having that conversation, and I had it, earlier before there was the lockdown, before we knew that things had really gotten to a aggressive, violent place. I had a colleague who said, okay, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go back to my office. And this is before we knew that they had breached the Capitol, but I knew that tensions were rising. And I said, take your pin off. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, we don't know what's going to happen, but if somebody encounters you who you shouldn't encounter, they do not need to know you're a member of Congress. Take your pin off. And if somebody asks, you work in one of the offices, you're an admin in one of the offices, just get, and I thought it was interesting because my mind initially went to, like, this has the potential to be a truly horrific day.
Yeah.
And it was. But I think that we should realize that it was by virtue of which side, frankly, they made it into. So they made their way on the Senate side faster than they made their way on the House side. If they had entered the building and broken the doors on our side faster, we would have all been in there. So when they got to the Senate chamber and they had evacuated out faster, so much of the timeline is actually just shocking to think that, we got lucky. But if they had really meant to do malice and had been a bit more organized, it could have been far more horrific than it was.
Makes me angry all over again.
Yep.
Juliet, you spent a career thinking about crisis preparation, crisis management, crisis response, and have dealt with so many different ones. You were watching this, you were on air at the time. What was the bubble on your head?
God. So for a while I had been, from my academic perch, had been documenting and writing about Trump's unique terror tactics. And I want to just be clear to the audience, I'm very sheepish. I don't call Trump a terrorist. It's helpful for people to see how his tactics align with the kind of stuff that the three of us have been involved with. And so about 2 years ago, I started writing about and commenting about the particular technique that he was using, which was stochastic terrorism, which is, stochastic just means random, but it was he was a genius at it, which is a capacity of, I'm just going to show a little bit about this because, I have to do slides, but I'll be quick here. It's just this capacity, incitement of random but utterly predictable acts of violence for political gain. Because remember, terrorism, to call what he does violence does not get to the core of what Trump does. His kind of rhetoric is for political purposes, which is a form of terrorism. It used to be Democratic governors, and then election officials, and then public health officials, and then of course what was happening on the Hill, where the Congresswoman was on the 6th. So he was able to incite it in a way that was quite majestic, I guess, in some ways, which was it was vague enough that people like us would go, what did he mean by free Michigan? Like, stand back and stand by, Proud Boys. Or even leading up to January 6th, I think it was a December 25th tweet, come on January 6th, it's gonna be wild. Right, so we start deconstructing that like rational people, like he can't possibly be meaning what he says. His people hear it. We know what free Michigan means. It means that you have a governor that needs to be gotten rid of. We know what stand back and stand by means. It means Proud Boys are waiting for the call, which ends up being January 6th. And we know what wild means. We know what fight means. We know what, think about stop the steal, right? Think about that terminology. Stop how, right? It's not, that's a language of action, right? In other words. So for years he had been doing this, and then remember all of his people when you call them on it, they go, oh, he was just joking. Oh, he didn't actually mean that. It gives plausible deniability. So it seemed like this was the perfect way to describe Trump. But I always felt kind of sheepish about it. I would use it on air or in some of my writings. But, you know, to call your president a terrorist, it seemed too much like, you know, far resistance for me, even though I'm very anti-Trump. You also want to be careful. But then it just became too obvious. And so leading up to January 6th, it was just interesting. One of my jobs for CNN is to also not get on air. I mean, in other words, what I try to do is put some, you know, if like there's rallies or something, I just, you know, I monitor for them and say, you know, not a big deal, or don't make a big deal of this or whatever. So leading up to January 6th, my heart rate started going up because something happened around December 25th. I think maybe the legal arguments all ended, maybe a whole bunch of stuff ended, and he had no options. Yeah, thanks for taking that off. And so he started talking about January 6th, and it was that language of fight. You could look at the websites and stuff. So I start progressively getting more nervous to CNN, which, you know, is just like, what are we doing? What are you doing? Here's where I'll be if you need me. But it was just hard to tell, honestly. I mean, it just, you know, you saw some movement of people going to the city. You know, you guys, everyone's going to laugh. People like, this is, you know, what's your intelligence like? People like me look at the weather. The weather was really good. I mean, that's like, honestly, like, you know, people like good weather. They do crazy things in good weather. And so I started to get very, very nervous, and so was positioned for them. I start to get the phone calls, this is my fancy CNN studio now in COVID, and just get positioned, and ended up doing, actually, they never got me physically on air. I was doing call-ins just because they had so much, you know, what Abigail was saying, just so much imagery that they had to. So something happened, just a couple of things. I mean, one is the narrative of Twitter and elsewhere was what you know, is the Capitol Police were, you know, were not good, and they were too, you know, weak or whatever. There was a whole day of this, and day or two. And in fact, some of our colleagues in media, including, I have to say, you know, MSNBC and others, had the first days of coverage were like, you know, this is collusion. If this had been what Black Lives Matter. And then I kept saying, we have no freaking idea. I mean, you know, to Abigail's point, we have no idea what's happening to her. We have no idea. And the other was, of course, being so outnumbered from a preparedness. Your goal is just to simply make sure everyone gets out alive. You're not there. So I thought one of the most interesting images that I only saw later was the New Yorker video where they're in the Senate, and the police officer is alone with 6 guys, and the reporter says to him, "Why aren't you getting them out? This is that crazy guy who's sitting in the chair." And the guy in the chair says, "There's a million of us out there." So honestly, the Capitol Police guy has no idea whether that's BS or not. I mean, million's a lot, but could be 50,000, could be 5,000, could be 50, like all of those matter. The second is the police officer does this. He basically says to the reporter, "I'm completely outnumbered. Like, my goal is, you know, de-escalate and get these guys out of here," right? And because he's hearing what's happening to the Congresswoman and others, which is, you know, that this has gotten violent. So the coverage then begins to shift, in which a couple things are happening, which is the greasing of the runway from, honestly, from March of 2020, when the former president starts to, you know, really talk about, if he loses, it's unfair, right? That's his standard. To January, through December, which December 25th, it really does start to change, through January 6th, the morning of, what he says, and his failure to protect. I mean, if there's any part of the impeachment proceeding that I think has visceral reaction, I was really glad that it was in the video yesterday, and Representative Raskin's video yesterday, is while it's going on, he's talking about Pence. He's not telling, I mean, he's telling them to stop, but also this day will be remembered. What the hell? Like, I mean, you know, this is, so that's sort of my takeaway, which is, and I guess I should go back to stochastic terrorism, which is around December of 2020, when he starts to lose illegal cases. And I think we're going to look back and see that's probably when he realizes he lost Georgia. It changes from stochastic, which is this random liberate, stand back and stand by, to January 6th, fight, stop, wild, all that language. So I don't sleep late at night about the First Amendment on this one. This is so obvious to me. He was the operational and spiritual head of a domestic terrorism effort. And I think we'll find out more about the Capitol Police's failure to prepare might also be aligned with who was in charge. I think some of this stuff that's coming out of DOD about what the National Guard was allowed to do, what they weren't allowed to do, basically the entire incident from the civilian, the entire incident command broke down. And you're basically, from what I can tell, you're having people like, Kellyanne Conway calling from her home to try to get, the White House to call the Pentagon. I mean, that's a breakdown of incident command. I just want to end with one thing, and then when we get into it, so because I always like to end. So I'm actually quite pleased with some of the arrest records that we're seeing. I'm going to end on a good note for this, at least. So when we think about the future of this, there's after this happened, there was a question about, oh my God, is this country divided? We are divided. I'm not Pollyannish. I didn't wake up yesterday. But are we divided on violence? And is our country so divided that violence is going to be the only solution? And then if that's true, what do you do with it? So I wrote a piece for The Atlantic, which I've been doing columns for, how to end MAGA extremism. And it seemed clear to me that the tools of counterterrorism would actually work in this regard, which is if you want a terrorist, look, Nazism doesn't die with Hitler. It just gets less recruitable, it gets isolated, it gets shamed. Racism doesn't die with the civil rights movement, but it gets shamed and isolated and minimized, and all the things that you want to happen with an ideology. And that would be true of what I call violent MAGAism. That's the best terminology I have for it, because it's a hate stew. It's the conspiracy, it's the race. Let's not forget the race and anti-Semitism. And so that means we have to isolate Donald Trump. We have to, in the counterterrorism terminology, you basically have to go after the leader, not violently, but you deplatform him, you isolate him, you prosecute him. So this morning, Georgia just announced an investigation of what he did. You get public support of him. Biden shaming of it. I think Biden's so good at shaming it with his sort of, I'm not paying attention. Come on, man. Like the whole sort of like, that's a crazy person, right? And the banks not supporting him and all the stuff that we're going to see, even if you don't get the vote in the Senate, this is all important. And then I'll just end with why I think that the data is suggesting it. On these arrest records, I'm going to make up the numbers right now, but let's say there's about 200 arrests right now. Make them up in the sense I don't know the exact numbers. Only about 20 of the arrests are of people of known membership in a white supremacy group. Okay, so why you're like, why is that making her happy? Because I've got 180 people who literally have no affiliation but to Trump. They are domestic terrorists without a cause now. They could turn to white supremacy, although I don't know how many of them define themselves as that. They could turn to violence, or you could provide I think they should be arrested. I think they should serve time, but also that we may have an off ramp for that group once Trump is completely isolated. So what would have made me nervous is if out of 200 arrests, 198 of them were organized terrorist groups. And I would have been like, shit, sorry. I would have been like, this thing was really, or this is a terror leader who radicalized people that wouldn't have otherwise been radicalized possibly, except for those 20. You isolate, you prosecute, you do everything. But I do feel more hopeful that this is a fixable, not perfect, but a fixable issue. So I'll leave on a good note.
Thank you, Juliet. Abigail, if you could put your old case officer hat on for a moment. So you've certainly seen phrase intelligence failure used too quickly, too easily, too fastly. You've certainly seen your share of policy failures, which are blamed on intelligence failures. But as you reconstruct sort of what happened on this. What were the kind of the root cause of kind of the physical failures to protect the Capitol, against what seems, in retrospect, seems to be a manifestly apparent threat, with manifest vulnerability on the part of the Capitol building, where the very thing that people wanted to stop was taking place, i.e. the certification of the vote.
Yeah.
How do you assess the failures of the day?
So, and I guess I think I would divide this up into a couple different buckets. One is the actual physical structure of the Capitol complex. It is an open place. It is an accessible place. It is that way by design. At every door, tourists, the public now, and this is different during COVID. We have it closed to the public because of COVID precautions, but typically there's a door you walk through, you go through a metal detector without incident, the building is yours. And within the Capitol complex, there's areas that are meant to be closed to the public just because they're places of work, but that is the culture on the Capitol. And it is the culture that, many of my colleagues enjoy the fact that between votes, when you're standing at the stoplight to head over to votes from your office building, you're there with tourists with their maps, you're there with joggers, that's the culture. So the physical perimeter of the building, and they had started to do a little bit of kind of fencing off of places because of the upcoming inauguration, but that fencing was stakes in the ground and that green meshy things that you use to keep deer off your yard, right? Or in some places it was the bicycle racks, and there's some pretty violent videos of people busting through those, bicycle racks. And so that was the perimeter. And so, that's the physical space of it. And then you have the question of well, why was that the physical space of it? And I think it comes down to really a failure of imagination. Mm-hmm. If you think through history of all of the events and all of the days when there are people outside the Capitol, they're protesting, they're banging drums, they've got signs, all of the events that have happened in Washington, no one has ever tried to breach the United States Capitol, right? No Americans. And yes, there was a violent incident where one individual person walked into the Capitol and shot and killed 2 Capitol police officers in the 1990s. But that was not associated with, what this event was viewed as, which is a First Amendment activity, right? There's First Amendment activities across Washington, D.C. all the time. And so I think that the fact, some of what, Juliet was talking about, where there was this tenor, it's going to be wild, come to DC, stop the steal, this anger, some of these signs, I think for some people, and I would say, for members of Congress, it was a failure to imagine what could possibly happen. I haven't been fully briefed on, what information was known, what was shared, what wasn't shared. Certainly I think the command and control structure of, what needs to happen, and who's the go-to person is clearly there's some after action reports that need to be long and lengthy as to, when, and I would just make a very simple argument, when you're evacuating House leadership, maybe we're identifying that it's not safe for anyone to be in that space, right? And to be clear, there are certain folks who surely should have been evacuated out faster, but we evacuated the House Speaker and then resumed debate as though everything was normal, knowing that there were people banging on the doors of the Capitol. At this point, we didn't yet know that they had gotten in. So, I think there's a couple of these sort of elements. And then looking back, people acted as though and people have assessed that this event was so surprising, and it was shocking. But when you think about the fact that there has been event after event, and we view them in isolation, right? So there was Charlottesville, and we viewed that in isolation. And the president at the time did not give the response to that event that I would argue anyone with any sort of platform, let alone the president of the United States, he did not respond in the way that I deemed appropriate for the president of the United States, right? He did not aggressively denounce white nationalists and neo-Nazis marching in the streets, chanting anti-Semitic statements. He did not aggressively denounce that a woman was murdered when she was hit by someone who was terrorizing a crowd with a car. And then bit by bit, we see vandalism at Jewish cemeteries. We see the massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue. And so these events, in fact, from a physical and like a manifestation of violence, there are threads that are there, so that we know that there's a possibility of violence that exists someplace within the community, within the country.
Yeah.
That's one piece of it. But then the other piece is the sort of the rebuke that wasn't happening to this notion of stop the steal,
Yeah.
right? Because stealing is a crime, right? So, and what Juliet said, we stop. Well, how do you stop someone from stealing? It wasn't count all the ballots or we demand a recount. It was stop the steal. And so, I would also note that each place along the way that some of my colleagues had the opportunity to say, you guys, let's lower the temperature. I'm really sorry. I know you're really unhappy. I'm unhappy, but our candidate has lost, right? Like in our history of transition, president to president, that happens. You get to be upset that your person lost. You get to be cranky about it. You get to complain about the person coming in, but you don't deny reality. And so some aggressively denied it, fundraisers off of Stop the Steal, totally allowing for this mentality to continue. And then some just stood back and said, oh, the people in my district, they feel unhappy. They feel upset. They feel that something wrong happened in Georgia or Arizona or Pennsylvania. And so I think there's a lot of components, and we talk a lot about the what happened with the intelligence of it. But I think that we don't spend enough time thinking about where were all of the places where we basically made very fertile ground for this to occur, and we didn't pay attention to. And I would say we within Congress, we didn't pay attention to the thread that connected all of those violent acts of extremism. And then we get to a day. And because none of those pieces are all brought together, and because we're not planning for worst case scenarios, and Paul, I'm sure you have the same mentality from a CIA perspective. Yeah. If you are not planning for the worst, you are not planning. And so, we see a First Amendment activity and expect it to be the same. And, I appreciate what you said about the Capitol Police officers on that day, because from my perspective, there were officers who were, fighting, trying, beaten. We've had 2 Capitol Police officers take their own lives because of the stress of this event and what it meant. And the fact, I would argue that at times it was talked about as they had failed us.
Yeah.
They didn't fail us. They, and I think about the image of that police officer in the Senate as he was keeping those people occupied as they were, vandalizing. We were stuck in the House chamber. And so however many people there were in the Senate, it's that fewer people banging on the doors where the rest of us hadn't yet evacuated, right? Like that is something that we have to recognize and value. And then the one final thing I would say is, I think that we absolutely need to recognize the types of threats that exist. One of the things I did remark on, and while I commend, Capitol Police did a tremendous job, I kept thinking, I don't know if their protocols are ripe for dealing with a changing threat, right? Like this isn't a fire. This isn't a chemical attack. This isn't a bomb that went off and now we need to get out. This is a moving, amorphous threat that we can't see and that we can't isolate. And that's in the form of people on the other sides of those doors. And there was something where I thought, I'm just not sure that the possibility of this type of event is something that, people had trained for. And frankly, we had never done any level of training ourselves. You got to have, a group of people who are able to respond to those sorts of threats as well as police may be leading them. So I'll stop there, but I could clearly go on and on about this topic.
Thanks, Abigail. Julie, as part of a segue to the kind of the next piece of looking forward of what next, let me just ask you, there have been, calls for a 9/11 style commission to look back and do, what happened on 1/6, what were the root causes, who was responsible, and what sort of changes and structures, recommendations need to come out of that. Do you think that's important in this case? And how would you focus it if you did support it?
Yeah, so I absolutely think that it's the equivalent of a 9/11 commission. And there's a couple reasons why. I agree with you, Paul, that this to me is more of an existential threat, despite all the minimization that I was talking about earlier. But I mean, in other words, the potential for political leaders to successfully potentially undermine the democratic process is something we need to explore as a democracy if we want to thrive as a democracy in the future. So where 9/11 was exceptionally violent, and I turn to intelligence officers probably for their truth in this, it wasn't an existential threat. I mean, it was, no one thought our democracy, if anything, it made our democracy stronger, as you were saying, Paul, it unified us, right? But I didn't, I think of climate change as an existential threat, right? I think of presidents who would undermine our democracy as existential threat. So I do think that it's essential in the way the 9/11 Commission was essential. And I think it lays out, if you're successful at it, it lays out the greasing of the runway to this moment and where were their various off ramps. I mean, I can name a half a dozen small gestures that changed the course of this country, that one would hope that the course of this country wouldn't depend on 6 gestures or moments, right? They begin with, Fox News calling Arizona maybe a little bit too early. Like, honestly, like, imagine if they hadn't called that. Then you're heading into a week in which he's saying it's all fake, right? Some sort of, I can't even remember his last name because it's hard to pronounce, Georgia Secretary of State, a Republican who has the guts and the backbone, more than we're seeing in the Senate with Republicans, to say WTF, right? I mean, let's just be clear here. It's the Georgia wins. Right? It is Stacey Abrams and others getting, if we had gone into the 6 as a minority, the Democrats, imagine what that would have been like. So I can name like 6 of those that if they had just gone slightly the other way, this, he might have had grounding, right? And so that's why I think, we've got to be more resilient than that. And then plus the more tactical lessons learned about what happened, what was requested. This wasn't a typical intelligence failure. If people like me without specialized intelligence are starting to get agitated, just simply looking at a Twitter feed and on online resources. And honestly, I don't even do the crazy online stuff. I was just looking at Facebook. Like, I don't do the Parler and all that stuff. So that I would recommend it, and I think it could have. I think if we did it once this impeachment is over, if we did it within the next year, I think it would be very, very successful. I do want to raise one thing, and it's for people in the audience. One of the successes, I think, of the Republicans right now, or at least of this narrative, is to separate race from what happened. While I said these people, most of these members were not members of white supremacy groups, Donald Trump's anger about the vote was anger about Black voters in the end, right? If there had been more white voters, this would not be the case. And it was about the disenfranchisement of Black and minority voters. I mean, if you look at the legal strategy between November 6th and basically December 25th, it's not, the legal strategy is Black people voted, right? And we don't like Black people voting because they're not voting for us. And it's really important in our narrative of what happened on the 6th, not to lose race and the racism that animated Trump and his legal strategy from the violence of January 6th, even if the violence was coming from some other hate stew. It makes me frustrated when we lose that, because that's essentially the legal strategy of Donald Trump was Black people voted, and I don't like it.
Thanks, Juliet. Abigail, just turn the same question back to you as you look forward and think about what could come out of a 1-6 commission? What sort of either structures or actions or changes do you think are needed, or are they needed as we look at this threat manifestation?
So my hope would be that if there were a 9/11 style commission, that it would focus on all of the elements that created the fertile ground for one person or a small group of people to plant a seed of an insurrection, right? Because, while certainly I have voted to impeach the president for inciting an insurrection, and I place significant blame for so much of the actions of that one man, that's really an easy thing to get our arms around. And the way you avoid that in the future is you don't have another president who's willing to incite an insurrection and hopefully will, choose wisely at the ballot box. But that's an oversimplification, and we have to look at where did we normalize certain aspects of his behavior? Where did we normalize or minimize the growing sentiment and division and anger? And some of its division and anger grounded wholly in racism and white nationalism. Mm-hmm. Some of its division and anger, grounded in a myriad of other kind of pieces. But we saw what can happen in our country where we create these divisions and a blame for a whole host of things gets put on the other, right? I mean, and it's a strategy as old as time, dividing people, otherizing a group, and trying to cede power by utilizing that type of power getting and power securing means. And the extra piece here is that because we see the conspiracy theories and the QAnon conspiracy theory, most especially, that has functioned, I would argue, as a real gateway and on-ramp for people, for people across the country who are not necessarily, to Juliet's point, who are not members of white nationalist groups, who wouldn't necessarily think that they're even keeping company with, a domestic violent extremist group. Yeah. But they have slowly tiptoed because of conspiracy theories that are popping up on social media, that are popping up in their space, where they're starting to doubt reality, and then they're pushing that. All that to say is, we need this type of commission to say what happened, what were the contributing factors, where did, and it's been talked about a lot, but where did social media play a role in creating this fertile ground? Where did other people, through not recognizing the threat, help ensure that that ground continued to be fertile? And then from there, how do we ensure that people who might have been pulled down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and led to believe things that are completely untrue for one person or a group of people's political ends or objectives, how do we be better truth tellers? How do we, and in fact, I serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we've done hearings focused on how some of our European partners actually in their elementary schools focus on, discerning what is propaganda, what is information, because those countries have long been on the receiving end of, foreign disinformation campaigns. So I think there's so many buckets here that it's the ideology, the lies, the conspiracy, and then there's the actual, terroristic action, the actual insurrectionists who are violently and physically entering the Capitol. And those things grew out of the same space. So we need to see, what that ground was, how it was made fertile for those extremes. And then how do we, in some cases, criminally deal with those who would perceive or pursue violence. And in other cases, how do we get at the root cause and ensure that people aren't getting dragged into these dangerous conspiracies?
Thank you. On sort of a tactical level, I'm concerned that the next Timothy McVeigh has been put in the oven to bake.
Yeah.
And then we're going to see that come out. But Abigail, you've described it, and Juliet as well. I think the much more central and important issue of how we have a whole of society, starting with education, response to an enduring, perhaps endemic problem. Look, lots of questions. I've got a million questions, but we're
Good.
going to turn over to the audience to start asking questions, and Caitlin will moderate that.
Great.
So over to you, Caitlin.
All right, thank you. So for anyone that has a question, I please ask you to direct it to the Q&A box. And we already have a few, so we'll get started. The first one is about disinformation campaigns, not to denigrate the anger out there for some of the divisions in our society, but what can we say today about foreign actors weighing the scales in one direction or the other? Is there any evidence to see that?
Can we go, Abigail?
Any of you?
So I would just say, in terms of directly related to January 6th, not that I'm aware of, and I think it's really not that I'm aware of related to that particular event, but I think that it is important that we saw, and certainly the Mueller report draws this out, how foreign entities utilized social media in an effort to sow divisions within our societies and within our communities, right? And so that's one piece of it. And we know that in particular, the Russians have done it. We know that they have, in Texas, they created a rally and a counter rally from Russia that was organized by American citizens because of their online efforts. And so recognizing the real threat and the real possibility there is important. And then where it leaves us now, there's no information that they would have had direct involvement with this state. And, I leave that to the criminal investigators to continue digging in. But at this point in time, I would say the real concern is that when we think about the fact that foreign entities have previously sought to divide us through influence campaigns, and now they see just how divided we can be, that leaves us ever more vulnerable to these sorts of efforts into the future.
But I just say, I think the only thing I'd add, I totally agree with the Congresswoman, is, I guess two things. One is that was just a breach of what should have been a secure area. So like now all of it, it's like if do you remember, some of you will remember, do you remember about like 3 months after 9/11, a plane went down in New York, straight down, and it ended up being pilot suicide, but horribly, but all people like me could think was, oh my God, we thought we fortified this, and 3 months later, right? Or so you have, and I think if that had been terrorism, the trajectory of post 9/11 would have been even more domestically insane, because you would have been like, oh my God. So one was just the visual of the vulnerability. But I want to put this in the context of COVID, and this is where one has hope of a competent presidency. I say, for those of us who aren't in government, we kind of have the luxury to look away a little bit. My nights are longer. I'm on air less. You're sort of like, wow. Like there's my children. That's what they look like. And so one of the things that the foreign disinformation campaign has been good at is this isolation. I sometimes wonder the extent to which the isolation, the boredom that Abigail was talking about, these people weren't racist. They wouldn't view themselves as members of a white supremacy group. They're being captured by conspiracy and are locked up year two. I'm entering year two, right? You're entering year two. To what extent that psychological warfare has been successful in getting more people willing to go into the pit. I mean, normal people experiencing what we're experiencing, we have our moments, right? I mean, as I like to say about COVID, I can fall asleep, I can't stay asleep. Like all of us have our issues, right? And so I do wonder the relationship with the fact we're in a pandemic.
Our next question is from Lauren Zaberg, and it's along the same lines. What can we learn from those other countries that Congressman Spanberger described who are more resilient against conspiracy theories and cyber threats, and perhaps their evolution to embracing education and training for the public? How can we apply these lessons here in a federated educational system? What legislative or executive options do we have?
I'm going to give a real short answer and then toss it over to Juliet. If you want to. I think actually what's a foundational challenge that we as a country are trying to overcome is that when it was made clear through, through reporting, through public reporting, through intelligence, all the rest, that a foreign adversary nation tried to influence the American people, that should have been a, wait a second moment, right? Like that should have been a, you don't mess with us moment. But instead, because some of it was related to electoral politics, and because of the way that then candidate, ultimately President Trump handled it, he pulled it into, if you believe that the Russian government, that Russians tried to influence American people, you are doubting his election, which in fact, those are very separate things, right? And even anybody who's even aggressively, focused on disinformation efforts will acknowledge that they didn't change votes, right? And so maybe some people stayed home, maybe there was some impact, but no one is saying, this candidate won because of that disinformation campaign. I'm not saying that, but because even acknowledging it actually happened, jumps you ahead 10 steps to people saying, oh my gosh, how could you say that, he didn't really win? Well, I didn't. I'm saying a foreign adversary nation aggressed against us, and we should be united saying, stop. We should be united trying to make sure we're resilient. We should be united, with our private companies that bring this information saying, hey guys, get this under control because we will not be influenced by the Russians or anyone else. But because of the way he handled it, and others in his circle, it changed the way we as an American population even interpreted that threat and frankly, that aggression. And I think we're going to have to really try and build back from that to reset what it means to protect our space, right? Like if they had come in with a submarine or a tank or, whatever, that's a clear thing. But this disinformation, and nobody wants to ever admit that they were influenced either, right? Like that's also a little bit of the kind of human psychology of it. And we got to do that before we can do any of the other stuff. Just admit that, like, this is a threat to us.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with all of that. I might take it, I guess, no, not further. My opinion about a lot of this has changed in two ways. And one, I'm going to criticize a platform that I'm, with the media. We have the parts of the American public are looking for this stuff, right? In other words, they're leaving Fox and going to OAN or whatever those places are called, in the sense that I respect differences of opinion. I don't respect 2 + 2 = 5. That's that. I mean, that's you could talk to me about freedom of speech all you want. 2 + 2 does not equal 5. So so there's an element in the American public that we don't criticize, right? In other words, if you listen to CNN long enough, they criticize Trump, they criticize it, but there's an element of the American public that I think we need to stand together and say, to the extent we can, say, this has nothing to do with red or blue, conservative, Republican, Democrat, whatever. It has to do with 2 + 2 = 4. And why are they searching for that? Do they actually believe it, or are they looking at it with a wink and a nod? The other area, which is more controversial, which will probably fall into Abigail's camp, is I used to be much more benign about the social media platforms. Maybe like 2014, 2015, if you said, should they be regulating stuff? Should they be, I'd say, child pornography, snuff films. Yes. I'd have the, Mark Zuckerberg, I heard a New York Times reporter on the Daily say this, and it just stuck with me, and it was so good. He said, Mark Zuckerberg convinced us, all of us, that his decision not to decide about content was an objective decision. But in fact, that decision not to decide was in fact subjective, because given the way that the model works, also, you're getting all the crap and the lies, and then they're feeding off of it, to the extent that the most viewed Facebook page in Pennsylvania the day of the election in 2016 in Catholic areas of Pennsylvania was that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. Facebook sees that, they know that's not true, and they're not doing anything. So I've gotten much more I like the voluntary efforts of deplatforming, but I do think that Facebook has to be broken up now, has to be regulated as a content provider, not a platform. And we need to start getting serious about the power of these platforms, and two, enough with the BS, Mark Zuckerberg. Like, we don't buy it anymore. The Supreme Court, like, come on, like, you know, you're going to self-regulate the Supreme. This is people who don't know that Facebook has I don't know if they call it the Supreme Court, but it has been called the Supreme Court. Given their humility, they call it the Supreme Court to set guidelines for speech and conduct and all sorts of stuff. But I'm not a big fan of self-regulation for an organization like Facebook.
So we have a few questions pushing back on the commentary we've had so far. So
Good.
one of the questions is, why are 200 people's bad decisions or radicalization an insurrection? There were hundreds of thousands outside who were not violent or lawbreakers. If he incited the crowd, he didn't do a very good job. How is this so different from the Portland sieges or Tim McVeigh?
So an incitement or an insurrection is not in the number of members. So the insurrection is defining is the purpose of the violence to undermine or literally insurrect a democratic institution. So it could have been 3 people and I would have still called it an insurrection. And then on your question about numbers, this is fair. So I'm a good news person. I'm looking at these numbers and I'm seeing hope in some ways. I can have my moments, but so the couple of numbers that I look at, the rally itself, this is Donald Trump's last stand rally. He's beckoning people to DC for weeks on end. I mean, I think the first time he mentions June 6th is in mid-December. So he's got 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. It was, I think they thought down below the Capitol was 7,000 or 8,000, was not huge. That's not huge by any stretch of the imagination for a rally. The number that come up to the Hill is maybe another 2,000. So some combination of that, a large percentage of that group realizes possibly no good is going to come of this. And then entry, I haven't seen any definitive numbers, but I think it's just a couple hundred. So you got to separate the people who believe that the election was stolen from violence. And I'm very careful to do that. I call it violent MAGAism. I don't call it MAGAism. I don't call it, lots of people can believe what they want. So those numbers suggest, but those numbers wouldn't have existed but for the rallying cry of Trump. There's just no question in my mind. And I think that's what you're seeing laid out. I mean, come on, McConnell admitted that. I mean, he knows that.
I would just add to that, even just the actual physical infrastructure, where there were choke points, where there's entry points, there could have easily been more people who entered. Frankly, the police, finally with the Metropolitan Police Department arrival, as they were being beaten with flagpoles, with fire extinguishers, with hockey sticks. There's a lot that went into this that we can't sort of begin to determine how many more people would have come in. But to Juliet's point, the goal was we were there doing our constitutional duty, and they came to stop it. And whether they came to stop it by breaking down doors, murdering a police officer, and violently defacing the Capitol, or whether they came to stop it, by walking in even non-violently to the space and trying to stop what we were doing, and it was an insurrection. This one was particularly violent, and certainly when there was violence of this type, the brutal beatings of police officers, I don't personally just view that as, in 200 independent bad decisions. That's an angry mob that murdered people.
Yeah.
Our next question is from former Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper. Is legislation required to call out domestic violent extremism so that is on the same legislative plane as foreign-based violent extremism?
I'm not answering Jim's question. I'm going to turn that. Can we get him on screen? He's just sitting in his office throwing these hard I want a softball, Jim. What kind of friend do you think, Abigail and I are not happy? I want a softball.
That is a question I would like Director Clapper to actually.
I know.
But I won't punt or deflect, though I do think you're probably better suited to answer this question at this exact moment, sir. I think my answer to that is, I hope that this will be an ongoing conversation. Certainly, there are significant differences between foreign-based extremist groups, and even, frankly speaking, our approach at times between different types of extremist groups, foreign-based, can vary. What I think we should be considering is, do we have the correct statutes in place, or frameworks in place that would allow for law enforcement to be able to do the types of investigations necessary? Are there charging statutes that are appropriate if we are to see into the future a significant growth of networked, engaged, and not individualized domestic violent extremists, but actual true networks that are then operationalizing in the way that, frankly, Al-Qaeda or ISIS have operationalized. And so I think that those are questions that we need to dig into. Those are conversations that we need to be having, from a what's constitutional, how do we look at this if these are American citizens, people in this country, and then also what are the real constraints that face those who would investigate these types of violent networks, and what are the challenges that they contend with in trying to, track them and get in front of a potential violent attack. But I'd love to have a conversation about this with you further.
Yes.
Well,
Hello, Mr. Clapper.
if I can jump in here.
No, we're thrilled.
The reason I ask is some of this on a much larger scale, January 6th was, but it brings back memories of the Fort Hood shooting,
Yes.
as well as the Boston Marathon bombing, because the aftermath, and all due respect, some of the critiques I got from the Congress was we weren't sufficiently invasive domestically. So I think one of the things, and right now it's an inhibition, frankly, because the focus of the national intelligence community is external.
Yep.
So if we're going to recognize domestic violent extremism as a equal or greater threat than the foreign domestic violent extremism, then we need the legislative underpinning so that the intelligence and law enforcement communities can look at them on the same plane. That was my point.
Yeah. My 2 cents on this is, I would, everything depends on the language, right? Because a different administration, we might be like, oh, we want to push a domestic terrorism statute under this administration because we're worried and we know that they'll be careful, but we wouldn't want it to be turned on Black Lives Matter and stuff. So you definitely would want, the language would matter, but I don't want the audience to think that we don't have the capacity.
That's right.
Under present laws, because look, I'm in Boston right now. I teach tonight. I'm teaching on the Boston Marathon bombing. There was no domestic terrorism charge. Someone was, the appeal is now pending, but someone was on death row based on murder and use of a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, there's plenty to disrupt, to go after folks.
But I think that Director Clapper did make an excellent point that even among my colleagues, sometimes there is a kind of gut reaction and to say, well, why didn't, this is what we do with Al-Qaeda, or this is what we do with insert X terrorist organization. Why is it not the same? And frankly, talking through and saying, well, because we made it this way, or in fact, the folks before me made it this way, because they are different operating environments, different, we are at home within our own, operating under the Constitution in the United States of America. And so I think that, being very thoughtful, if we're considering any legislative changes, we have to be very, very, very thoughtful about what that could look like.
Well, that's precisely the point. I would, if I were still in the intelligence community, I'd want that defined legislatively about
Yeah.
what are the guardrails, the limits, the parameters for both intelligence as well as law enforcement. You'll notice that all the charges lodged against those who've been identified and indicted are pretty benign. You know, it's unlawful entry, disorderly conduct, things like that. There's no mention of terrorism, which is really what it was. So that's what prompts the whole question. But I can tell you from personal experience, I would love to have what the limits and the authorities are for at least the intelligence community defined legislatively.
Yes.
So then you know what the ground rules are and what the limits are, and because they're stipulated in legislation. That was my point bringing this up.
That's exactly right.
By the way, this is a great discussion, and hats off to both of you for
Thank
and
you.
for Congresswoman Spanberger. I think this has struck me as something of a cathartic just to be able to do this.
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim, you were two quick points, and then we're coming up at the end of our session, so we'll turn over to Abigail and Juliet for final comments. But Jim, you'll recall last summer we talked a little bit about the outrage that occurred when there were reports that DHS was collecting open source intelligence assessments of protesters in Portland, and just how shocking that was to some folks, how controversial, and it cost a DHS Intel director his job on that.
Yeah.
So it just shows how you know what a hard tightrope you have to do in that. But I also I'd also know that Europeans are quite used to dealing with that and have the structures in place that allow domestic intelligence collection prior to a crime being committed for law enforcement purposes, whereas our situation is mostly set up to investigate post-crime being committed. And I think that's a fundamental difference between, say, an MI6 approach and an FBI approach.
I think Congresswoman Spanberger made a good point about having, which I completely agree with, by the way, is having a 9/11-like commission that over time could address this more deliberatively and thoughtfully and come up with some recommendations about what form legislation might take. And of course, that's what happened after 9/11. That's what resulted in the Intelligence Reform, Terrorism Prevention Act, which of course has its flaws, but again, that was, I think the same process, I think, would be applicable here.
Thank you, Jim. So we got just a couple more minutes left. Juliet, let's turn over for you for any final thoughts, comments you want to leave us with, and then to Abigail.
I want to thank, well, first Jim, who I just interviewed for my next book. And so I'm becoming familiar with him as well. And his counsel for all of us is just fantastic. And Caitlin and Paul, and I'm not sure my team is on, but it's great co-hosting these things. And we should, maybe, I don't know if it's good news or bad news that our worlds are intersecting now between, foreign intelligence or intelligence and Homeland Security, but I'm really grateful for your support. And obviously the Congresswoman, thank you so much for everything you're doing and this moment and keep it up. And if I could vote in Virginia lawfully, I would. But I just want to say to the students and others, so things look really crappy and horrible and things aren't budging and whatever. And I just, part of it is that I think there's more of a center than we sometimes give America credit for in a good way. And I think the extremes have voice and passion and whatever. But I think if you look at where the American public actually is, I think it is more unified across the board than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And part of that, it requires the middle to expel the cancers and the extremes. And that's what's happening, and it's painful, but nonetheless, hope springs eternal for me. It better. I got 3 kids, as does the Congresswoman.
Is it over to me? Well, so I do like ending on a positive note. So I would just end with these points. I think the conversation's been very valuable. Juliet, it was a pleasure to join you. Caitlin, thank you for this. Paul, thank you for the invitation. And Director Clapper, so lovely to see you. So for everybody watching, I think the positive points that I would make is while we're focused on just how horrifying January 6th was from the actual physical acts of violence, but also the attacks on our actual institutions. I think that it's important to recognize that our institutions held, right? So they attacked our Capitol. We were evacuated out. Police officers were beaten. Glass was broken. People died. And that very night, we returned to that very chamber and we acknowledged, as is our constitutional duty, the results of the election. And a colleague, and I'll tell the story somewhat vaguely because I don't think I've heard him tell it publicly, a colleague whose family immigrated from another country said he talked to his parents and his father said, but the difference is like you went back. And that to this man's father who had escaped conflict in his home country said, that's the difference. You all went back and you stabilized the foundation of our democratic republic by conducting your constitutional duty. And so our institutions held. We all had a significant wake-up call about how vulnerable we are as a nation, how vulnerable our people can be to extreme ideology, what can happen when that ideology takes root. And so for all of us, this is a wake-up call, I think, or for those of us who've been really awake on this issue for a while, it's also a moment for us to take stock of the fact that we all have a role to play in ensuring that the foundation of our society is based in truth and based in reality, and that we endeavor to disagree, that we endeavor to sometimes tell people what they don't want to hear, full of disappointment, but that at the end of the day, our institutions held when tested in such a significant way. And so it will be a hard time as we build out of this, of course, exacerbated significantly by COVID, but we are on the right path and that's what matters. And when we were really tested, our nation survived that test. So that's my bit of positivity.
Good.
Moving forward.
Abigail, Juliet, thank you so much for spending
Thank
time
you.
with us today, for sharing your experiences and really leaving us both with understanding of some of the realities that we face, but really ending on a positive, hopeful, centrist note. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Caitlin,
everyone.
thank
Bye,
you.
Congresswoman. See you later.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.